right, so as they already mentioned, I'm Jessica Dykstra, and I've been working as an SLP for 10 years now, and I've been in research for the past 6 years or so. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that first. There we go. Okay, so as you may know, autism spectrum disorder is a developmental disorder, and it was discovered in the 1940s, actually simultaneously by 2 different researchers on 2 different continents. And so we started learning about it a long time ago, but it's only recent that we've really gotten a lot more evidence around autism spectrum disorder. The new DSM-5 came out last year, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, and they kind of redefined autism. So before there were these separate chunks, it was autism and Asperger's syndrome, and now it's all merged into one disorder called autism spectrum disorder. There's really 2 main areas of need. So there's the social deficits, which are kind of the communication piece, things like forming relationships and having the social emotional reciprocity with people. And then there's also the repetitive and restrictive behaviors and interests piece. And that's things like unusual sensory interests or hypo or hypersensitivity, people who might be focused on a very specific interest or topic. There's also things like just kind of repetitive behaviors, motor movements, or playing with a toy in the same way. So those are kind of the 2 main areas they're focused on now. And what they do is, now that it's a single disorder, they rate the level of severity of it. And so people can get a 3, and that means they need a lot of support, or they could be like a level 1, and that means that they don't need as much support. So you guys might be wondering why autism spectrum disorder matters. And for you all, for people in communication sciences, it's a really important topic. For one thing, it's becoming really common. So we know in 2000 they did a study, and this is all data from the CDC, about 1 in 150 kids had autism, and that was already up in numbers from previous estimates. And just probably a month ago, a new estimate came out. It has 2010 down there because the data is from 2010, and now it's at 1 in 66 children. And the numbers for boys are 1 in 42. So if you're working in this field, you're going to run across kids with autism or adults with autism, depending on where you're working. If you're in the schools, there's over 500,000 kids in the US that are being served under the label of autism. And if you're an SLP or an audiologist who's thinking about going into a more medical field or working with older patients, you're going to see people there too, because there's an aging population from this big boom, and you're going to be serving people in a variety of contexts. So it's really important going into this field that you have knowledge. Another thing that I find, and people who've been in this for a while, is once you're in a field, if people think that a topic is related to that, they will approach you about it. So even if you're not working with people with autism directly, people are going to come up to you and ask you questions, and you want to know the answers. So I'm going to give you kind of a brief run through of autism spectrum disorder, some of the research that's going on, and then I'll talk more specifically about my research. So if we think about areas of research, there's kind of a very broad range of research, from what we call basic research, that's kind of very technical, looking at brain cells and that kind of stuff, or looking at pharmacological things, to things that are more applied, like being out in the schools or being in homes. So kind of starting at the top here, we have etiology or cause, and there's a lot of research that's going into, so where does this come from? And we know that autism definitely has a genetic component. They've done twin studies, and they've figured that out. But they're also starting to think, with this increase in prevalence, that there might be some environmental factors that kind of influence the presentation of the disorder. So maybe a child is already susceptible to it with genes, and there's something in the environment that's changing what's happening in development. There's kind of a neurology, biology, physiology, where they're really looking at kind of functions in the body, and so things like brain imaging studies, where they're looking at specific pathways or parts of the brain. There's things with physiology, like measuring heart rate increases and kind of seeing how the body responds for kids or individuals with autism. And then looking at relationships with autism to things like gastrointestinal disorders and that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of research going on in there, and part of that is to help understand maybe where the autism, part of kind of the cause of it, but also what we can do to treat some of the symptoms that are more physiological. Identification and assessment has been a big focus, and so we know that early intervention is important. If you get kids into services early, they're going to have better outcomes. And so there's been a lot of work going into, let's see if we can find ways to screen the whole population. We know it's 1 in 66 children now, so if we use these screeners, we're likely to catch people. And so there's people that are working with physicians to get them to screen kids at their well-child visits. And then there's assessments to try to pick up autism earlier and earlier so we can get kids into the programs faster. And then when we kind of swing around to the bottom, the intervention, that's something that is obviously really important. And you can kind of think of the intervention in different pieces. So there's the more medical side of things where they might have pharmacological interventions that they're using with kids with autism. And then there's the social behavioral side of things where they're really working with the kids in therapies, in schools, in homes to work with them on changing some of their behaviors and skills. Kind of a newer area of research is this implementation and dissemination piece. And so what happened in research, in many areas of research, I think, especially in education, is there was all this research going on in universities. And they would bring kids into clinics and do something with them and do it very intensely, and sure enough, they would improve. And then they said, this works. Go do it in the homes and send people out. They're maybe doing the intervention for less time or in a different way than was intended. And it hasn't really translated to being effective in the real world. And so there's this new focus. ASHA actually just recently had their first conference on implementation science. And it's really looking at how you actually work with practitioners in the field or parents in the home on training and coaching them to use the procedures that were intended. And then also from a research perspective, how are we developing these interventions in a way that makes sense? We don't want to develop something in a way that it can't be done in schools because that's not going to help the children at all if we develop something that's not possible in the real world. And then the last section, the presentation and life course. So you can kind of think of that as what the original maybe researchers did. So Leo Connor, who discovered it, he was looking at the symptoms he saw and kind of watching how it progressed. And there's a lot of work around that now, looking at which symptoms change in young children into adolescence and adulthood, and just thinking about the different profiles of children and adults on the spectrum. So I'm going to start talking about my research in autism. So I am not in that medical, biological realm of things. I'm kind of on the more applied side. So there are a lot of people doing awesome work in the basic sciences. I'm looking at what happens with the work that we take out into the schools and looking at things in kind of more natural settings. One of my big interest areas has been individuals with autism with the most significant needs. That kind of comes out of my work. I worked at Kennedy Krieger School. It was a school for kids that weren't doing well in public schools. We had a lot of challenging kids, but they made a lot of progress there too. And it piqued my interest to see kind of the different presentations of the kids. So some kids were extremely bright and did so well on kind of these cognitive standardized tests. And then when you were in the classroom with them, they had a hard time attending and they weren't super socially engaged. But then there were other kids who maybe didn't have the language skills, might have even been nonverbal, but really wanted to interact with you. And so I just got interested in thinking about those differences across the spectrum and how that might impact what interventions we choose to do with those kids. The other main area I focused on is school-based interventions. And I worked in a school, so that was part of it, but I also think that's where a lot of these kids are served for a bulk of their formative years. So they're often entering at 3. Some of them stay till 18. Some of them stay till 21. That's a long time we have with them to make a difference, and I want to make sure that we're doing that well. And so I think there's a lot of research starting to focus on intervention in the schools. The project that I work on now primarily is the Center on Secondary Education for Students with Autism, or we call it CSA. It's a multi-site center, so there's 7 sites across the nation, and we are trying to develop a comprehensive program for high schoolers with autism. It is the first time something like this has been done, and we're finding that high schools are really complex environments. Kids are moving between classes. There's a ton of requirements that, for graduation, and a lot of pressure on the teachers for test scores. And so learning how to do that implementation piece in the high schools is a lot of what we're working on now. One of the things that I've found the most rewarding so far with this study, we've just been doing the pilot work so far, so the very beginning early studies, is work with peer-mediated interventions. And that's been great to see. So we find peers that are typically developing, and we either find them in their classes or some kids who have lunch together, and we form a group, and it can be either social or one that's kind of focused on helping the student engage in the class. And so we have one student who is in a self-contained classroom. He's completely separate, but he goes into a regular gym class, and we have a group of peers that are supporting him in that. And it's been really cool to see how much the high school students help each other out and care about one another. And they can, because the peers are there regularly, they can make really big changes for the students with autism. They're more consistent for them than the teachers who may be switching from year to year. And then I'm going to spend kind of more time talking about ASAP. So ASAP, or Advancing Social Communication and Play, I spent a lot of time in my doctoral studies doing this, and then I have a study that's starting up in this fall. I'm recruiting for it now. So it is a supplemental intervention program, which means that it goes alongside more comprehensive intervention programs. So it doesn't matter what they're doing in the classroom. We hope that they can plug this in alongside of it. This was developed for preschoolers, and like I said, I'm going to be adapting it for elementary school kids who are still struggling with these skills. And we developed it for the public schools and in the public schools. So we worked with a team of researchers from UNC and then also people in a local school district, and we did these small studies where we would revise the intervention, go try it out with them, get feedback from them, revise and adapt it again. And so Dr. Linda Watson and Dr. Brian Boyd were leading this effort and helped us to really put together an intervention that we hope can be used in preschools. And they're actually doing a study in 4 different states right now to test the efficacy of the intervention. It targets a hierarchy of skills in social communication and play. And so what we try to do is we take little steps, little small steps that are going towards an ultimate goal of advancing their social communication skills, which we know are really important skills, and then also for their play skills, which help to develop language as well and the peer relationships. And we use some very kind of simple evidence-based practices, so things like fading or prompting and fading, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next talk. Things like reinforcement, so providing reinforcement when they do a skill as we would want them to, so if they request something, honoring that request. So just very simple things that can be done in the classroom. One of the other things that we use a lot with kids with autism are the visual supports. So you can see up here there's a little play set. Kids with autism really struggle with pretend play. They often do things like building towers or lining things up, but moving into this idea of pretend play is challenging. And so if you set up a structure that kind of gives them ideas for the play, then it helps facilitate that play for them. So I'm actually going to show a short video. This is from one of the classrooms we worked in for the preschool classrooms. And this is a kid who really struggles to engage in the classroom. If he was on his own, he would probably be sitting in the block center, and he would have a train, which he loves trains, and he would be spinning the wheels. Or he might wander around the classroom and maybe touch different toys but not really fully engage. He's also not a kid who would initiate much communication. He would tend to stay on his own. So this is probably 6 months into the school year. And I'll show you a video. The teacher in this classroom is amazing. And they're going to be playing doctor with him. So I think that is a really great example of a kid that might have not been kind of pushed to go into pretend play. He was doing a lot of kind of construction things, but they weren't facilitating that pretend play because it was very hard. And they set up this visual support system, and they have it in their centers all the time. So eventually, as he develops those skills, he might be able to use them independently. They'll still have that box there with kind of the cues. Right now, I think he likes the interaction of it. You can see like she kind of waited, and he pulled the bear's head. He wanted to hear that noise. He was looking to her. So I wish I had had a video from him earlier in the year, because this is night and day from what you saw. So, all right. So that is kind of what I am doing now in my research. I'm taking it into elementary school classrooms, and I'm going to work with kids that hopefully kind of have similar needs to this guy that you just saw, and figure out how we can continue to address those skills in an elementary school setting where there tend to be more academic demands and expectations placed on the kids and the teachers. So do you guys have any questions about the research? I know that was a big whirlwind of kind of the big picture and then a little bit of what I'm doing.
Have you done anything different, or have you done any studies on the differences between like individual therapy whereas like having a group of children?
That's a great question, and I'm actually going to address that in the next talk, but I will tell you now. So this research does involve a one-to-one component and a group component, and we do know that with autism, it is important when you're working with individuals with autism to give them that one-to-one time to really engage them and give them a lot of opportunities for practice, but also to move it into the group setting so that they generalize those skills, because moving those skills into using them with other people or in a group situation or with other materials is something that's really challenging for kids. So I know there's work around that. We haven't done like the comparison of actually, I take that back. We did do one study, a single case design, the one that you had mentioned earlier, that was looking at, what we did is we did the group intervention first and the one-to-one intervention second. And for 2 of the 3 kids, they didn't start making gains until they got the one-to-one. So we only did the group intervention, then we added the one-to-one, and that's when we saw the increases. So yeah, good question.
Quick question about your opinion on the new DSM-5 and the rating scale. And how it works. I mean, you mentioned the 2 different categories that you look at. So what if somebody's a 1 in one category and a 4 in another? I mean, how does that work?
You know, I'm not as familiar with how they're doing that diagnosis-wise, but I do know that they rate the two categories separately, I think. And I guess they must have to come out with some consensus score. But it's interesting because it's a very small scale. And there's a lot of range within autism. I know it's kind of controversial because people are worried that kids that are at sometimes what they call the higher end of the spectrum, are kids that have a lot more cognitive and language skills, that they might not actually qualify for DSM. I don't think that's proven to be true yet, but people are concerned about that. And so there are like some instances where it's like, well, is that impacting them enough to get that 1 rating? But yeah, I don't know what they're doing when kids are very different. And you're right, there are kids who might have a lot in the repetitive behaviors realm, but be doing a little bit better socially. So, yeah.
And then your opinion on the boom in numbers. What do you think is the cause?
Yeah. So I will say, and a lot of this, I'm going to talk about what people have talked to me about too. So not just my opinion, but other, like my advisor and other people that I've talked to in the past. I think this time, you know, before people were saying, oh, maybe they're just diagnosing more of it, they're using better tools, they're catching more of it. I think with this increase, there's just no other explanation. You can't keep having those increases and just say, oh, they're diagnosing more. And I will say too, just anecdotally, I think you notice more people around, just out in the community. Now, as someone who studies autism, I am at high risk for identifying everyone in the community as having parts of autism, but I do think there's more of it, and professors who I worked with who have been in the field much longer than I have have said the same thing. Like we just didn't see all these kids before. Like you didn't see them out in the community before. So I don't know what's going on, but I hope that they are able to figure. Clearly you also can't have kind of an epidemic rise that's only genetic. There has to be something else playing into that. So yeah.
I was wondering, are the interventions about the same? Like, do you have a more generalized intervention plan for kids with autism, or is it very specialized for the range, like the severity of the?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there are interventions that are tailored towards kids that have more significant needs to a degree, but a lot of it is the content you're addressing. So a lot of those basic strategies, they really work across the spectrum, the prompting and reinforcement and that kind of stuff. But there are like social skills interventions. I'm doing one right now in the high schools that's tailored towards the kids that have that are in general education, have average IQs, but have these kind of high-level social deficits. So there are more and more that are tailored more specifically to populations. But some of these general strategies, they cut across. In fact, they cut across all people, I would argue. You can, certainly kids, you can use the prompting and reinforcement. That's good teaching that you can use with all kids. And I think if people would think about that these specialized things that we're using with kids with disabilities would actually just be good to use across the board, that schools would be in good shape using those kind of across the board. So, yeah.
So we know that when we do interventions for kids with autism, we want that intervention to generalize.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering if you could speak about why it's so important to focus on the pretend play skills and what those contribute to in their greater language.
So pretend play is really, it's kind of kids' first job and it's kids' first learning experience. And so very early on, if you think about what you see kids doing, they're imitating their parents. They're cleaning, they're cooking. Some of us might not do that as much as others, but kids are picking up on the things that actually go on in the real world, and that's what they're acting out. So they don't get into that kind of fanciful Superman, princess stuff until a little later. The early stuff is really getting at what you do every day in life. And another thing we know from just developmental research is language and play go they develop side by side. And so they're developing vocabulary in that play. They're learning to interact with their peers. And so there's all these skills that will continue to grow and show up in other ways. And I believe there's actually a study that ties play behavior early on to later peer relationships in like mid-adolescence. So it does tie to later skills, but it's not. It does seem like one of those things. I know in elementary schools, when I move into the elementary school, it's going to be a hard sell to say, hey, let's do some play with these kids, because it's not seen as something that's important. And less so in preschools even, sadly. So, any other questions? All right, well, thanks so much for listening.